There are known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. But there are also unknown knowns. The ancient and esoteric order of the Jackalope is devoted to unearthing and sharing this knowledge in podcast form. Each episode we take some piece of miscellaneous esoterica that has slipped through the cracks of common knowledge and share it to you in an easily digestible format. No topic is off limits, except for the obvious. Hey there, Lodge members. After the unpleasantness of 2020, you might think we'd start 2021 off with a story that's hopeful and bright. Nope! The Prophet of the Pacific, presented by number 13. And Moses went up from the plains of Moab unto the mountain of Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, that is over against Jericho. And the Lord shewed him all the land of Gilead, unto Dan and all Naphtali, and the land of Ephraim, and Manasseh, and the land of Judah, unto the utmost sea, and the south, and the plain of the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, unto Zoar. And the Lord said unto him, This is the land which I swear unto Abraham, unto Isaac, and unto Jacob, saying, I will give it unto thy seed. I have caused thee to see it with thine eyes, but thou shalt not go over thither. So Moses the servant of the Lord died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him in a valley, in the land of Moab, over against Beth Peor, but no man knoweth of his sepulchre unto this day. And the children of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. So the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended. The Book of Deuteronomy, chapter 34, verses 1 through 6 and 8. Ira Colver Sparks was born in Peru, Indiana on December 10, 1886. By all accounts, he had an unremarkable childhood. Neighbors remembered him as an inoffensive youth of no particular promise who loved reading the Bible. Ira grew into an inoffensive dolt with no particular promise. He found employment as a humble carpenter, doing odd jobs for the folks around town, fixing chicken coops, rehanging screen doors, stuff like that. When Ira C. Sparks turned 35, he had a midlife crisis. Now, for most men, a midlife crisis might involve a sports car, frosted tips, a girlfriend half their age. Ira's midlife crisis was a little different. The Lord our God spoke to him and told him to take up the work of Moses, travel to the Holy Land, and convert the heathen. Well, a call like that cannot be ignored, so Ira Sparks threw everything he had into a beat-up old suitcase and started hitching his way to the coast. When he reached the Pacific Northwest, he took a job at a lumber camp for a few months, saving every penny he earned. In December 1922, with a wallet full of cash, Sparks took his passport and headed down the coast to San Francisco to buy a steamship ticket to Bombay, which turned out to be way more expensive than he thought. But Ira C. Sparks was nothing if not resourceful, and it helped that God showed him the solution to his dilemma. If he couldn't make his way to India as a passenger, he would make his way as freight. He scrounged up some scrap wood and built himself a box. Not a very big box, mind you, only about 30 cubic feet. He couldn't stand up in it, but it was big enough that he could sit down, or lie down if he bent his legs. It had a secret panel he could use to slip in and out undetected, and it also had a small pantry filled with potted meat, crackers, and 15 gallons of water. Sparks managed to convince the Toyo Kisen Kaisha Steamship Company to take the box, which he claimed held 548 pounds of personal effects valued at $15. The total charge for shipping it to Bombay was $24.42. Stevedores loaded the box onto the good ship Tayo Maru on January 2, 1923. There was a brief debate about where to put the dang thing because it was leaking water. Eventually they decided to just throw it into the ship's silk room. They figured if there was a problem, the stevedores at the next port of call could deal with it. Ira C. Sparks spent 5 days in his box as the Tayo Maru made its way from San Francisco to Honolulu. 5 days confined in a tiny box, in near total darkness, on a rocking boat, barely able to shift positions with his joints and muscles groaning in complaint, afraid to make even the smallest noise lest he be discovered, with nothing to eat but Spam and captain's wafers and water stored in old oil cans, with nothing to do but sit and be alone with your thoughts. Well, thoughts and 5 days' worth of excrement. Needless to say, 5 days was about all Sparks could take. The final straw was when he overheard the Tayo Maru's crew talking about moving the box to the lowest hold for the next leg of the journey. That terrified Sparks, who thought he would die alone down there in the dark, so he decided to take a stroll and weigh his options. He was spotted almost immediately by the crew, who were flabbergasted to see a strange man on board 5 days out of port. Sparks just gave them a sheepish grin and explained himself. "I'm going to the Holy Land to take up the work of Moses." When the Tayo Maru arrived in Honolulu on January 8, 1923, they turned Ira C. Sparks over to Sheriff Charles H. Rose. No one was entirely sure what to do with Sparks. He was an American citizen, so he wasn't an immigrant. He wasn't a passenger because he'd arrived as freight, but he wasn't freight either because he was a human being. He couldn't be jailed for vagrancy because he'd brought his carpenter's tools with him and he had $15 in his pocket. And he couldn't be returned to sender because there were still outstanding custom duties on his personal effects. The TKK Steamship Company offered to take Sparks back to San Francisco, but rescinded that offer when they learned there'd be a $200 fine involved for taking a passenger on a cargo vessel. In the meantime, Sparks was getting 3 square meals a day in jail, costing the good people of Honolulu County the princely sum of $1 a day. For a few weeks, Sparks was the talk of Honolulu, as a wacky local news story that kept worming its way back to the front page. The story even made national news. Man ships self to tropical paradise. It's easy to see why, especially when Sparks kept giving the press such good copy. I'm from Indiana. I have a message from God. I am on my way to the Holy Lands to seek the true word of God. When I have been given the message, I will give it to the world. Ultimately, everyone involved decided to throw up their hands and allow Sparks to stay in Honolulu with no charges filed or fines levied. He checked himself out of jail, wandered down to Pier 7 to pick up his carpenter's tools, clothes, and toiletries, and started looking for work. He eventually found a job working at the shipyard in Pearl Harbor. His box was returned to San Francisco so the bill of lading could be canceled. Sparks demanded a return of the $24.40 he paid in freight charges, but it was not forthcoming. The box had a brief run as a sideshow attraction, but eventually disappeared, a harbinger of things to come. If you thought that was the end of the story, you'd be wrong. If Ira C. Sparks couldn't buy a ticket to the Holy Land, well, he'd sail there under his own power. In February 1923, he purchased a 26-foot whaleboat from the Inter-Island Steam Navigation Company, which he rechristened the Dauntless and anchored near Pier Number 3. He spent all of his free time turning the Dauntless into a sailboat. He gave it a fresh coat of pitch, rebuilt the deck, and added masts and a rudder. This time, he wasn't alone. Christians who supported his mission sent him donations of money and food. An old sailor showed him how to rig up his sails and handle a boat. His co-workers from Pearl Harbor even pitched in, if by pitching in you mean watching him from the shore and mocking him with such pointed taunts as, "That boat will be your coffin," and "You're going to die out there." Sparks' co-workers might have had a point. His naval experience had been limited to a few rowboat excursions on Lake Mississinewa, so he was bound to make a few mistakes. The first time he launched the Dauntless, it took on so much water it almost sank. Workers from a nearby iron foundry helped him put on a new bottom. Meanwhile, port authorities warned Sparks that if he wanted to sail to a foreign port, he'd have to meet the same criteria as any other ship: file a manifest, prove he could navigate a boat, and get clearance to leave harbor. In July, Sparks accidentally pierced his hand on a spike while making some repairs. As he recovered, he took stock of the time and money he'd sunk into the Dauntless and decided he'd been a fool, so he scuttled and burned the ship. And promptly started construction on the Dauntless too. This time he went all out. The spruce dory was 22 feet long, 7 feet wide, with a mainsail and a jib and a comfortable cabin with a cot. It was loaded down with 80 gallons of fresh water, enough tinned food to last for 100 days, 2 bars of soap, a compass, maritime charts obtained from the U.S. Weather Bureau, and a revolver. Because the new Dauntless was under 5 tons, Sparks was able to circumvent federal regulations that would apply to larger vessels. He no longer needed to prove he could navigate, file a manifest, or get official approval to leave port. The Dauntless was ready by the beginning of December, but Sparks was in no hurry to leave. First, he thought it would be disrespectful to sail before Christmas. And second, he had apparently been getting cold feet, so he wrote to his father back in Peru to get his blessing, which apparently arrived as the new year dawned. On January 9, 1924, exactly a year and a day after his arrival in Honolulu, Ira C. Sparks and the Dauntless sailed out of Pearl Harbor shortly after noon. A crowd of 1,000 well-wishers came to see him off on his journey. He gave them a brief speech. "Goodbye, boys. I'm sorry to go. I like Honolulu. I have made many friends here, but I feel it is my duty to get to the Holy Land. Trouble not the master, for prayers for him who goes down to sea in the Dauntless. Leave that to him and God." Sparks hoisted a flag of his own design, white cloth trimmed with a golden braid, and set sail. The crew of the pilot boat leading him out of the harbor threw a lei to him. Sparks doffed his lauhala papale and waved it to the cheering crowd as he vanished from sight. Professional sailors thought Sparks was crazy to sail west in the harsh winter weather and doubted he would even reach Kauai. Others, like Governor Raymond C. Brown, admired his pluck and dedication and faith. though privately even they thought the poor fool was likely sailing to his death. On January 10th, the Dauntless was spotted 40 miles off of Barber's Point by a U.S. Navy seaplane searching for a drowning victim, which took a few photos. On January 14th, it was spotted by a Japanese steamer some 250 miles southwest of Niihau. And then, nothing. No sightings, just silence. The newspapers wrote him off as dead. But then, at the end of April, there was unexpected good news. Word of Ira C. Sparks and the Dauntless arrived from the Philippines. After sailing 73 days across open water, he had made landfall on March 21st at Tandag on Mindanao. It had not been a great trip. Sparks had been through storms and swells that tested his faith and his skills. He'd fallen asleep at the tiller and been knocked into the drink by a sifting boom, and he'd lost a good chunk of his provisions to rats. But he'd made it. He sent a message back to Honolulu for the faithful. "They call this boat my coffin, but I am not afraid. The vision that came commanding me to make this pilgrimage contained assurance that I will meet no danger on the way. I have a message from God." Sparks' new plan was to sail the boat through the Philippines to Singapore, where he would finish his journey to the Holy Land on foot. He took on some fresh water, replenished his food stores, and set sail from Tandag on March 25th. Locals spotted the Dauntless at Madamas Point, between Perang and Budas, on April 17th, sailing west. And then, nothing. No sightings, just silence. The newspapers wrote him off as dead. This time, they were probably right. On August 13, 1925, the Dauntless was spotted on the east coast of Zamboanga, near Garusan Island. It looked like it had been pulled onto the shore for repairs and maintenance. Oil, paint cans, brushes, and overalls were found on the boat. But there was no sign of Ira C. Sparks. A search of the jungle turned up a small hut nearby, but it clearly hadn't been used for some time. Ira C. Sparks had just disappeared. There was some hope that maybe he'd been picked up by a tramp steamer or was taking shelter with natives further inland. But no word ever came from Ira C. Sparks. Well, no reliable word. Quite a few messages were found in bottles or tied to the claws of mynah birds, claiming to be from a shipwrecked Sparks, but they were all clearly the work of pranksters. I wish this story had a happy ending. I wish I could give you the triumph of faith over adversity, of determination over incredible odds. But I can't. Ira C. Sparks had simply vanished off the face of the earth. He was declared legally dead in 1928. Many theories were floated to explain what had happened. Some thought Sparks had given up on his God-given quest and fled into the jungle. Others thought he fell overboard or committed suicide. The leading and extremely racist theory was that Sparks had been murdered by cannibal Moros so that they could get a hold of his gun. Family members and the faithful held out hope that Sparks was still alive, but any who went searching for his trail could not uncover a single trace. The Dauntless remained in its final resting place and became a landmark for sailors. Old Salt would point it out to young hands and declare, "That's where Ira C. Sparks met his end," and the young hands in response would say, "Who?" It was still there in the late 1930s, but it seems to have disappeared during World War II. To his credit, Ira C. Sparks followed the path of Moses faithfully, because if you remember, Moses is allowed to see the Promised Land, but not allowed to enter. What, did you think I put all that stuff from Deuteronomy at the beginning for fun? This story was pulled largely from contemporary newspaper reports. I actually stumbled across it while researching an unrelated story that'll close out this series. Turns out it's hard not to follow a thread that starts with Ira C. Sparks of Peru shipwrecked in Zamboanga while trying to sail a coffin to the Holy Land. As I did my research, what seemed like it would have originally been a fun little story suddenly took a dark turn, and that somehow appealed to me more. Because while I can cheer for triumph over adversity, I find that I've got a lot more sympathy for a dream deferred that ends in ashes and sadness. Wherever you may lie, O prophet of the Pacific, may you rest in peace. And that's it for now. We'll be back on January 25th with our next episode. What is it? Should be a fun one. Until then, Quiquid minime sciunt, optime scire. This podcast was produced by David White for the Ancient and Esoteric Order of the Jackalope. It is released under a Creative Commons 4.0 Attribution, Non-Commercial, Share-alike 4.0 International License. All rights reserved, all wrongs reversed. The script of this episode with sources, links, and more can be found on our website at orderofthejackalope.com. That's orderofthejackalope.com with hyphens between the words. Keep up with our latest updates on social media at Order Jackalope on Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, and Reddit. Or contact us via email at jackalope@orderofthejackalope.com. Want to join the fastest growing secret society in the nation? We'll show you our hidden secrets if you show us yours first. Visit our website and click Join Us for more information. Use the King James Version. Some later versions are perversions. Best thing Robert McElwain ever wrote.